The flight was uneventful, or at least it was supposed to be. In first class, passengers reclined in their seats, leisurely sipping their drinks, idly scrolling through their phones, or absent-mindedly flipping through in-flight magazines. It was a typical evening in the sky, calm and routine, until something changed. The shift in energy was subtle at first, but undeniable. A flight attendant, sharp-eyed and moving with a clear sense of purpose, halted abruptly at one of the first-class rows. There, an elderly man sat, his hat tilted slightly forward, his hands resting gently on his lap. She didn't smile. "Sir," she said, her tone clipped and firm, "you need to move to economy." Conversations around them paused. A few passengers turned their heads, curiosity piqued. Then more followed. The man, slow and deliberate, lifted his gaze. His expression remained steady, calm, patient, but not surprised. He reached into his pocket, withdrew his boarding pass, and held it up for her to see. The words, "First Class," were printed clearly in black and white. She barely glanced at it. "There's been a mistake," she said, unwavering. "You're not supposed to be here." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't argue. He simply kept holding the ticket between them, waiting for her to truly see it, to process what she was doing. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Recognition dawned among the passengers. They knew who he was. Clint Eastwood. The hat. The unmistakable eyes. The quiet yet commanding presence. But the young flight attendant, brimming with confidence yet completely oblivious, only saw a passenger she assumed didn't belong. One row behind, a businessman in a crisp, tailored suit nudged his wife. "Do you see what's happening?" he whispered. She nodded, her eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Clint finally spoke, his voice level. "I'm in the right seat. Check your list." The attendant crossed her arms, unyielding. "I don't need to check. This is a first-class cabin and you need to leave." The murmurs turned to hushed whispers. A passenger discreetly pulled out their phone, camera recording. Across the aisle, another flight attendant caught sight of the exchange. She hesitated, eyes darting between them, then quickly walked toward the front of the plane. Seconds later, another crew member arrived, the flight supervisor. She crouched slightly, her voice low but firm. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Without hesitation, Clint handed it over. The supervisor scanned it, checked her tablet, and then turned to the first flight attendant. "This is his seat," she confirmed. Silence. Passengers exchanged glances. Some smirked knowingly, others shook their heads. But the young flight attendant wasn't ready to let it go. She stepped back, squared her shoulders, and insisted, "He's causing a disruption." There it was. A flicker of something crossed Clint's face, just for a moment. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit exhaled sharply. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Another man, middle-aged, leaned forward. "Ma'am, you're the one making a scene." The flight attendant ignored them. "I'm going to escalate this," she announced, tapping her earpiece. The businessman whispered again to his wife. "She's doubling down, bad move." A new wave of tension swept through first class. The cameras were rolling now. People weren't just watching, they were documenting. The flight supervisor took a slow breath. She already knew this wasn't going to end well. "Ms., step over here for a moment," she instructed, voice measured. But the young woman shook her head, her voice growing louder. "He refuses to move. He's being aggressive." The shift was immediate. "Did she just say aggressive?" a man muttered under his breath. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The woman in navy stood up. "No, he's not. I've been watching the whole time." A voice from the back added, "You're the problem, lady." The businessman now had his phone fully aimed at the scene. "What's your name?" he asked, looking straight at the flight attendant. Her jaw tightened. Then a sound came over the intercom, a soft but distinct chime. The pilot was calling the supervisor. She stepped away to answer. Meanwhile, Clint hadn't moved an inch. He didn't need to. The room was speaking for him now. The young flight attendant stood stiffly, hands on her hips, realizing too late that she had lost control of the situation. The supervisor returned, her sharp eyes scanning the tension-filled cabin. Her earpiece was still live, but she didn't need an update. It was obvious what was happening. The energy in first class had completely changed. Passengers weren't just watching anymore, they were engaged. Some had their phones recording, others whispered to one another, shaking their heads. A few openly glared at the flight attendant, whose confidence was now visibly cracking. Clint Eastwood, meanwhile, still hadn't moved. The supervisor took a deep breath and turned to the attendant. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, voice even, "we've reviewed the manifest. Mr. Eastwood is in his assigned seat. There is no issue here." But Miss Reynolds wasn't giving up. She was too deep in now. Her face hardened. "He's making me uncomfortable," she said, her tone firm but betraying an unsteady edge. "And if I feel uncomfortable, I have the right to escalate." A low chuckle swept through the cabin. "Are you kidding me?" Someone 3 rows back laughed. The businessman muttered, "Oh, this just gets better and better." The woman in navy leaned forward. "So now we're calling discomfort a safety issue?" Miss Reynolds ignored them. She reached for her radio. "I'm notifying ground security." That was a mistake. The businessman turned fully in his seat. "You do realize you're being filmed, right?" He lifted his phone, the screen glowing. "This is already online." For the first time, Miss Reynolds hesitated. The supervisor saw her chance and stepped in. Lowering her voice, she said, "Miss Reynolds, I need a word. Now. I have the right to—" "Now," the supervisor repeated, her voice brooking no argument. The young flight attendant's mouth snapped shut. She glanced at Clint as if still hoping for some validation, but the moment had passed. The room had spoken. Her expression stiffened, her shoulders squared, and she turned sharply, following the supervisor down the aisle. The tension in the air didn't disappear. It lingered, crackling like static electricity. Passengers shifted in their seats, exchanged knowing glances, their expressions ranging from disbelief to amusement. Some still had their phones recording, waiting to capture what would happen next. And Clint? He remained exactly where he was, hat tipped slightly forward, watching it all unfold. A man in a baseball cap turned to his wife. "This is going to be everywhere by the time we land." She nodded, already scrolling through her phone. It was everywhere. The first clip had hit Twitter 5 minutes ago. 30 seconds of Miss Reynolds confronting Clint Eastwood. No context, just her demanding he move, his quiet defiance, the murmurs in the background. Retweets were climbing fast. "This girl just tried to kick Clint Eastwood out of first class. Imagine not knowing Clint M.F. Eastwood when he's sitting right in front of you. She really bet her career on a losing hand." Someone had even added the Dirty Harry theme music over the clip. The businessman caught sight of the screen over his wife's shoulder and chuckled. She... A ding from the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was calm, measured, but seasoned travelers knew what that meant. Something was happening. The flight supervisor returned, her posture straighter than before. She cleared her throat, then met Clint's gaze. "Mr. Eastwood, I'd like to personally apologize for the misunderstanding." And just like that, the tension shifted. Some passengers nodded, others clapped lightly. The businessman smirked. Clint finally moved, not to stand, not to argue, just the smallest nod. That was all. The apology was now official, and the world below was already catching up. The flight hummed with quiet anticipation. The supervisor had made her apology, but everyone knew this wasn't over. Ms. Reynolds had yet to return. The murmurs in first class felt less like idle chatter and more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. A notification lit up on the businessman's phone. He glanced down, then let out a low chuckle. It was everywhere now. Breaking, Clint Eastwood targeted in bizarre first-class dispute. Another post surfaced, this time a different angle. A passenger across the aisle had caught the exact moment Ms. Reynolds claimed Clint was making her uncomfortable. The comments were brutal. "Well, she's done." Man really sat there like a boss and let the internet fight for him. Across the aisle, the woman in the navy blue suit turned to Clint. "You know this is going viral, right?" He finally spoke, voice low and even. "Not my first rodeo." She smirked. "Maybe, but for her, it's her first and last." A metallic click from the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are now making our final approach. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival. The timing was no accident. This wasn't just a descent. It was corporate damage control. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. The businessman whispered to his wife, "They're waiting for her at the gate." A few rows back, someone muttered, "You think she knows?" She didn't. The wheels touched down with a jolt. The usual announcements followed, but no one in first class reached for their bags. They were waiting. Then Miss Reynolds reappeared. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. The authority she carried before was gone. Now she moved like someone trying to act normal while knowing everyone was watching. And they were. Phones were angled, some passengers not even bothering to be discreet. The businessman checked his screen again. Over 3 million views. He smirked. Miss Reynolds saw him looking, saw the screen, saw the headline. Flight attendant picks the wrong fight. The woman in navy leaned toward Clint. She's gonna wish she stayed home today. A final ding, seatbelts unclicked, overhead bins popped open, but still no one in first class moved. Then the real show started. A suited airline official stepped on board, flanked by 2 others. They weren't looking for a passenger. They were looking for her. Miss Reynolds. She barely had time to react before the first official, mid-40s, serious expression, leaned in and whispered something. Her face drained. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen, but the tension was electric. A few phones lowered now, almost feeling bad for her. Almost. The official stepped back, nodded to the supervisor, and then, without another word, Miss Reynolds was escorted off the plane. No scene, no yelling, no argument. Just the quiet realization that her career had ended before she even left the runway. A few passengers clapped, some chuckled. The businessman shook his head. She really thought she could get away with it. Clint exhaled through his nose, stood and adjusted his jacket. As he stepped into the aisle, he nodded once to the supervisor. She nodded back, silent but understanding. Then he walked off the plane. And the internet finished what it started. The terminal was already buzzing, passengers from the flight pouring into the concourse, dragging their carry-ons, checking their phones, whispering to each other. The energy around Clint was palpable, like ripples through water. People weren't just recognizing him, they were waiting to see what would happen next. Airport security stood at the gate, not for him, but for her. Miss Reynolds walked stiffly ahead, flanked by 2 airline officials. She wasn't in cuffs. This wasn't an arrest, but it felt like one. Humiliation wrapped around her like a straitjacket. A few bystanders held up their phones. The businessman from first class strolled past, grinning at his screen. "It's live," he muttered to no one in particular. That was the real problem. This wasn't just a bad day at work, something that could be buried in paperwork and forgotten by Monday. It was happening in real time. A teenager in a hoodie leaned against a pillar, laughing as he scrolled. "Bro, the memes are insane," he turned his phone to show his friend. Someone had photoshopped Miss Reynolds onto a dirty, hairy poster, captioned, "You feel entitled, punk?" Clint stepped into the main terminal, his stride steady. He had nowhere to be, but everyone else did. A woman in a Delta uniform hesitated before approaching him, not Miss Reynolds' airline, but she gave a polite nod. "Mr. Eastwood, we just wanted to say." He lifted a hand, cutting her off. "It's done." She hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. Because that was the thing. For him, it was over. For Miss Reynolds, it was just beginning. An unmarked conference room. Frosted glass. Beige walls. A table meant for serious conversations. Miss Reynolds sat, hands clasped, across from 2 men in dark suits. Not security, not managers. Corporate. The taller man leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Miss Reynolds, do you understand the severity of this situation?" She exhaled. "I made a mistake." The older man, gray-haired, unreadable, tilted his head. "A mistake?" He tapped his tablet. "You escalated a non-mission with a high-profile passenger. You ignored protocol. You attempted to involve security under false pretenses. That's not a mistake, Miss Reynolds. That's several." She swallowed. "I misread the situation." The taller man sighed. Miss Reynolds, the situation has been seen by 8 million people in the last 4 hours. He tapped his screen. Every news outlet has picked it up. Customers are threatening boycotts. Your name is trending above a war zone. She blinked. What? The older man slid his tablet across the table. She hesitated, then looked. A news site. Flight attendant tries to kick out Clint Eastwood and gets kicked out instead. Below it, a live counter, retweets, shares, comment threads stretching longer than her career ever would. One tweet pinned at the top. This girl really thought she was the main character, LMAO. Her stomach twisted. The taller man rubbed his temple. The CEO has already received a call from our largest investor. He let that sink in. Your employment with this airline is terminated. Effective immediately. She opened her mouth, closed it, a long, suffocating silence. Finally, the older man leaned back. You should leave through the staff exit. If you walk into the terminal, you'll have cameras in your face before you hit the parking lot. She nodded. No, she'd built her whole life around this job. One shift, one decision, one moment of arrogance. And it was gone. Clint was already in the car when the statement dropped. He wasn't waiting for it. Didn't need to. But it still lit up his phone as the city lights slid past the window. Airline statement. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Eastwood for the unacceptable treatment he experienced aboard our flight. The crew member involved has been dismissed, and we are taking steps to prevent such incidents in the future. Predictable. Lazy. The businessman from first class texted him. They threw her to the wolves. Clint smirked. Of course they did. That's how this world worked. Make a choice, bet on the wrong outcome. Then live with it. The car cruised through the city, neon reflections stretching across the windshield. His phone buzzed again. More texts, more headlines. He'd seen this play out before. Different faces, different scandals. Same damn script. A big corporation screws up. Social media explodes. Someone gets sacrificed. The wolves get fed. And the world moves on. His driver, a sharp-looking guy in his late 30s, finally broke the silence. That was some crazy shit back there. Clint exhaled through his nose. You follow the news, kid? The guy snorted. Don't need to. The whole terminal was talking about it before you even got off the plane. That's how fast these things spread. He glanced in the rearview mirror. You think she deserved it? Clint didn't answer right away. He'd spent decades watching people dig their own graves. Some deserved it, some didn't. This girl? She was young, arrogant, thought she was in control. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. He finally spoke. She'd bet against the wrong man. The driver whistled low. Damn right she did. At airline headquarters, a different storm was brewing. The damage control meeting had started before the ink was dry on the apology. Executives sat around a sleek glass table. Screens glowed with real-time analytics. A PR director, hair pulled back, eyes sharp, clicked through slides. Engagement is still climbing, 70% negative sentiment against us, calls for boycotts, influencers are picking it up. The CEO, a man who looked exactly like someone who had never flown economy, stared at the numbers and realized the wolves weren't done yet. The CEO pinched the bridge of his nose. Worst-case scenario? A young analyst, likely the only person under 40 in the room, cleared his throat. Lawsuits, public hearings, a congressional inquiry if this snowballs into a broader discussion on discrimination. The room stiffened. The CEO's expression darkened. And best case? The PR director shrugged. The internet forgets in a week. Not if Eastwood keeps talking. Silence. The CEO leaned back. Has he said anything? The PR director shook her head. No interviews, no comments, just that leaked text. That was bad. A man like Eastwood didn't have to speak. His silence said enough. The CEO drummed his fingers on the table. What's the temperature on Reynolds? She's done, the PR director said bluntly. No airline will touch her now. She's getting death threats. Deleted all her social media an hour ago. Someone winced. Corporate sacrifice was one thing, Public execution was another. The analyst shifted uncomfortably. Look, we needed to fire her, but now it's turning into a pile-on. The CEO scowled. So what? She made her bed. Sure, the analyst hesitated, but now the public thinks we let it happen. That was worse. The PR director tapped her pen. Maybe we let this one breathe. No comments, no feeding it. The CEO exhaled. Fine, let's hope Eastwood lets it die. But everyone in that room knew the truth. They weren't in control anymore. Miss Reynolds sat on the floor of her apartment, a half-empty bottle of wine beside her. Her phone lay face down on the table. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching. She already knew what they were saying. Former flight attendant goes viral for all the wrong reasons. A master class in how to ruin your career in 5 minutes flat. The internet's latest main character. Who's next? She wasn't crying anymore. That part had passed. Now she was just numb. Her friends had stopped texting. Her email was flooded with hate. Her parents had called, disappointed. She picked up the remote, flipping through channels, desperate to find something, anything, that wasn't about her. Then she saw it. A breaking headline scrolled across the screen. Clint Eastwood breaks his silence on airline incident. Her stomach dropped. Hands trembling, she unlocked her phone. The tweet was simple, no PR fluff, no legal jargon, just 5 words. People make mistakes, let her go. At the Eastwood Ranch, a fire burned low in the hearth. Clint set his phone down, picked up his whiskey, and took a slow sip. For him, it was over. But not for the world. His 5-word statement landed like a thunderclap. Within minutes, it was everywhere. News outlets, talk shows, celebrities chiming in. The same mob that had spent the last 24 hours tearing Miss Reynolds apart suddenly pivoted. If Eastwood says let it go, maybe we should. Damn, he really just walked out of the smoke and told everyone to chill. So we're just going to pretend we didn't call for her head 10 minutes ago. The tone shift was instant. On her couch, Miss Reynolds stared at her phone. The flood of new comments blurred before her eyes. She wasn't trending for disgrace anymore. Now it was pity. A notification popped up. A direct message. She hesitated. Then tapped it open. A name she never expected. Clint Eastwood. Her pulse spiked. She swallowed hard, clicked the message. It was simple, shorter than his tweet. You'll be fine, just get up. She blinked, read it twice, 3 times. That was it. No lecture, no scalding, no sympathy either. Just get up. The glass of wine sat forgotten beside her. She exhaled, set her phone down, and for the first time in 2 days, she stood. At airline headquarters, the crisis team was still wide awake. The PR director rubbed her temples. We're getting calls from journalists asking if we plan to reinstate her. The CEO groaned. You're kidding. She slid her tablet forward. This morning they wanted her burned at the stake. Now? They think we went too far. He scrubbed a hand down his face. We're not rehiring her. That ship sailed. The young analyst cleared his throat. Sir, technically, she wasn't officially fired in writing. We pulled her from duty, but we never processed termination papers. The PR director's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting we backtrack? He shrugged. I'm suggesting that if we handle this right, we get out of this without looking like villains. Silence. The CEO leaned forward. Tell me what you're thinking. The analyst tapped his screen. Eastwood said let her go. He's not asking us to fix this. He's letting the public turn it into a redemption arc. We don't need to do anything except not look like we're fighting it. The PR director folded her arms. So what's the move? He smirked. We leak that she's being reconsidered. Let the public think it's their idea. If they push for it enough, we reinstate her. Not as an apology, but as a second chance. The CEO exhaled. And if she refuses? The analyst grinned. Then we get credit for offering. The next morning, Miss Reynolds' phone rang. She almost didn't answer. But something about last night, about Eastwood's words, made her pick up. Hello, Miss Reynolds? The voice was smooth, practiced, corporate. This is Emily Davenport from Airline Management. We'd like to discuss your future with us. Her grip on the phone tightened. I thought I didn't have one. A pause. Well, the woman said carefully, these situations evolve. We'd like to invite you back to discuss potential reinstatement.